So I have to be honest and say that I'm a little bit worried for Sony and also a little bit frustrated as well. Today was their announcement day. I'm gonna go over what they've revealed, my thoughts on that, also what they need for the A7S III and the FX6 to be successful and for their company to keep growing and thriving in this video space, and also why I have certain optimisms for their brand and where I think they can really compete. And I also want to say that this video is sponsored by Squarespace, the best way to make an amazing website. So the first thing that I want to cover is what Sony announced. A lot of us were hoping for the A7S III. I was not. I didn't think that's going to happen here. I was expecting the FX6, and that's a camera that I am very excited about. Honestly, probably even more excited for that camera than the A7S III at this point. But they released and they announced, actually they didn't release, they just announced firmware updates. So we have a firmware update for the FX9 and also for the Venice camera. And some things are great and I see why they're upgrading these things, and other things are kind of worrisome for me for their future cameras and how they're gonna compete. So the first few things that they announced is 1080p at 180 frames per second and 4K DCI recording. These things have been available in the FS7 for a long time, and I don't know why this wasn't in this camera at launch. It really doesn't really make sense. We also have the ability to load 3D LUTs and to shoot HDR with HLG. And by the way, this is gonna be released in October 2020. That's about 10 months after the camera was released. Now, the part that's a little bit more exciting is they are enabling the touchscreen option. I don't know if you guys knew this or not, but the screen on the FX9 was not a touchscreen at first. It had the hardware, but nobody knew that they had the capability to use it. We thought it was just non-touch, and that was a big complaint by many people. This also makes no sense why they wouldn't enable this from the start. If you have a great autofocusing system, which the FX9 does have, you want touch to focus. It is super convenient. You don't have to use it, but having that ability is great. Now, another change with that touchscreen is that the menus can now be touched to quickly flip between them and change different settings without having to use your little joystick. That is great. I'm sure that's going to come to the alpha cameras. And another thing you guys may have seen is 5K being shown off for this camera. Now, at first it may seem like you can record 5K internally with a 1.2 times crop or so up to 60 FPS. That's what some of these websites made it seem like, but in reality, that is not the case. So actually, if you want to record 4K DCI, you could do the full sensor up to 30, but if you want to do 60 frames per second, you have to do that crop, and then you're actually pulling 5K worth of data instead of 6K. Now, this is kind of a bummer. I would wish that Sony would just give us 6K internal recording, not because a lot of people need it, but just to be more competitive. But if you have to actually go in and crop to do that 4K DCI at 60 FPS, that is just kind of showing me that there's not enough power in the, the sensor, or possibly more likely the processor, to be able to pull that amount of data that fast. And that just means that if this is what their flagship camera is doing, how can we expect, better than that from the A7S III? That is kind of what makes me a little bit worried. If this is what the flagship is going to offer in October, what are we going to get from the other cameras? Now, before I talk about what Sony absolutely needs to change, I think right now, and also on the FX6 and A7S III, let me give a shout out to the sponsor of this video, Squarespace. If you've been thinking about getting a new website, now is the time, and Squarespace is seriously the best way to go. You can make a great looking website like we did with literally no web making experience. It doesn't matter if you want a portfolio, a blog, e-commerce, or anything else, you just choose a template and customize blocks of text and images. It's incredibly simple, affordable, and ours have been running for years, bringing in new clients thanks to its built-in SEO tools. Start your free 2-week trial with no credit card required by going to squarespace.com/maxyuryev or by clicking the custom link down below. And when you're ready to launch, you'll save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. Now, Sony has been a very secretive company for many years now. A lot of times we have certain rumors and we're expecting something come out, and then all of a sudden, bam, we have something different. And in many cases, it worked out quite well, where some camera companies were putting out 4K with crazy crops, and then we had 720p for slow motion, and then Sony comes out with a camera that's, a little over $1,000, has 1080p, 120 frames per second slow motion. It has audio during slow motion and autofocus while you're doing that, and the 4K looks great, the tracking is great. There were a lot of different improvements, and a lot of things that we asked for, they were listening to, which is why the A7S III was so successful. We have the big battery, dual card slots. A lot of that was great, and we had a lot of pleasant surprises. The thing is, it is now 2020, and a lot of companies are changing the way they do things. If we take a look at Tesla, for example, Tesla will announce what they are doing way in advance, sometimes 2-3 years before a car comes out. And then if they announce what they're doing, they announce some great specs, people get excited, and people will sit and wait that long for a new car to come out, say the Cybertruck right now or the Model 3 before that. And people know what they're going to be expecting. Some things get improved over time before the launch comes out. And people will wait. Instead of buying other cars and other things, if they had no idea about that car until launch, they would have bought something else. But people will wait for that. And we look at what Canon is doing now, where they're saying, hey, we're going to have the R5. This is what the specs are going to be. Yes, it's going to take a bit to get that camera out, but people get excited and people are seeing what the competition is doing and they're waiting to decide instead of buying something ahead of time. And that could be frustrating for some people, but at least we know what to expect. And Canon shifted the way they were doing things. And I think in 2020, Sony just needs to come out there and say, hey, this is what we have for the A7S III. This is what it's going to offer. And this is how we're going to be competitive. And the only reason that they wouldn't do that is if they don't have the specs and they can't offer what the competition is offering. Now let's talk about what the A7S III and the FX6 need to compete in 2020. Not back in 2018 when I think I made the first video. As time goes on, it's getting more and more difficult as they're waiting. Let's start off with the FX6. So first off, I think that should have a full frame sensor. It's called FX6. Just like the FX9, I really hope it does. If it doesn't, okay, that's gonna be a bummer, but not the biggest thing. It definitely needs to have 10-bit video recording, and it better have 4K 60 frames per second with 10-bit. In the past, I could see them maybe dropping that back to 8-bit like some of the companies have done, but it's 2020. The Fujifilm can do 4K 60 10-bit. That's a camera that's like $1,800. This camera is going to be like 6,000, maybe 7. It better have that. And that's about it. I think that's all it really needs. We know it's going to have great autofocusing. It's going to have IAF. It's going to have face tracking. It's going to have a touchscreen. It's going to be that body with the electronic ND, XLRs, really good ergonomics overall. If they do that, I think people are going to be happy. And even though it's not going to have RAW, it's probably going to have RAW output. So Canon, the C200 can do RAW internally. It could do 4K 60 internally on the Super 35 sensor with good autofocus. Technically, they're already behind in that way, or at least they're just playing catch up, but I think Sony shooters will be happy. And now for the A7S III. I think the first thing that needs to have is a price tag that really makes sense. I don't think it can compete with the EOS R5, at least on the spec side. We'll see in the real world. That has a lot of advantages, but I think that camera is going to be expensive, at least $4 grand, maybe $5 grand, possibly even $6. So if the A7S III stays at $3,500, it's going to be less expensive than the S1H, and it's going to be less expensive than the EOS R5. And a lot of people don't need 6K or 8K recording, anything like that. Now, it absolutely has to have a better codec. If they don't put a better codec in there, it's going to have a better codec. And we need to have 4K 60. And I believe it has to have 10-bit for 4K 60 to be competitive. Now we're gonna have a touch screen. The menus are gonna be able to, be able to swipe through and touch stuff and adjust, which is so nice to adjust your audio settings as you're recording an interview. It's gonna have IAF. It's gonna have the colors from the FX9 and the Venice. It's gonna have that profile. All that's gonna be great, but it's gonna max out at 4K 60. And I think there's a really good chance that it's going to have to crop in for that as well. That is unfortunate. I wish they didn't have to do that compared to the EOS R5, which they're saying 4K 120. I think that's going to be line skipping, throwing away data. But give us that option, Sony, if you don't mind. Let us choose if we want to crop with, oversampling and not throwing away data, or full sensor if we want that shallow depth of field, but getting rid of some of that extra info. Maybe it's not going to be as detailed. That would be great. And I think that's how they can exceed expectations. And I think most people would be happy with that. Most people don't need 4K 120. Most people don't need 8K recording or any of that stuff. The great autofocus, good battery life, maybe flip around screen, that would be fantastic. A much better codec, the upgraded colors, and 4K 60. So the question is, when will they release that, and how much is it going to cost? I think the price point matters now more than ever. They have to keep it very reasonable to be competitive, because I feel like on the spec side and the tech side, it's getting more and more difficult. I don't think they're going to have raw recording internally. They're not going to have raw recording externally on the system. Possibly that could change, but if the RAW is limited on these other cameras, the FX9, you have to spend $2,500 to have that raw output. How would it make sense to have, let's say, 6K RAW through HDMI like Panasonic is doing? I don't know. That would exceed expectations, but I am very skeptical with that. You guys let me know your thoughts on their announcements, and if they should be more upfront with what they're developing, kind of like what Canon is doing, some of these other companies, and what your expectations are for this camera. And if you guys watched this morning, how disappointed you were, because it just made sense to at least show off the FX6, that they have something going on. All right, guys, if you need a website, if you have an old website that is outdated, the SEO is bad, people aren't finding you, go check out Squarespace. I have a link down below. Do the trial with no credit card. Check it out, see if you like it. I know you guys will. I highly recommend them. Thanks for Squarespace for sponsoring this video. This has been Max, and I'll see you in the next one.